Dust coated Arabella's tongue, tasting of dry rot and surrender. At 19, she wasn't being married. She was being traded. A ledger entry squared away to a giant who smelled of bear grease and winter. The townsfolk gathered, eyes hungry for a tragedy, waiting to pity the girl handed over to a savage. They expected tears. They expected her to break. Instead, Caleb dropped a burlap sack on the church steps, and the sound it made changed everything. Sweat pooled at the base of Arabella's spine, itching terribly against the rigid whalebone of a borrowed corset. The tiny vestry at the back of the First Methodist Church smelled of damp hymnals, floor wax, and the stale tobacco clinging to her father's threadbare coat. "Abby," her father rasped. His voice was a dry, scraping sound, like dead leaves dragged across a porch board. "Abby, you know I wouldn't. If there was any other way—" Arabella kept her eyes fixed on the cracked plaster wall above his left shoulder. She didn't want to look at him. Looking at him meant seeing the roomy guilt in his eyes, the tremble in his raw, unwashed hands. It meant acknowledging the pathetic truth of their situation. If she looked at him, she might scream, and if she screamed, she wouldn't be able to stop. So she studied the plaster. A water stain near the ceiling looked vaguely like a vulture. Fitting. "I know, Pa," she said. Her voice lacked inflection. It was flat, hollowed out by 3 weeks of crying that had finally run dry yesterday at noon. There was no other way. Josiah Carter had made sure of that. Carter owned the general store, the livery, and the mortgage on the green farm. He also owned the deed to her father's gambling debts, quietly accumulated over 5 years of failing crops and rotting fences. Carter had arrived at their porch a month ago, his boots polished to a high, arrogant gleam, offering a choice. The farm or the daughter? Carter already had a wife, a frail, nervous woman who rarely left her parlor, but he had a twisted, covetous hunger for Arabella's quiet defiance. Then the mountain man had come to town. Nobody knew exactly where Caleb Wyatt lived. High up in the jagged teeth of the Bitterroot Range, beyond the timberline where the air got thin and the winters swallowed men whole. He came down twice a year to trade pelts and timber for salt, coffee, and gunpowder. This time, he had walked into Carter's store, slapped a heavy hide on the counter, and said in a voice that rumbled like distant rockfall, "I need a wife. Someone strong. I can pay." Carter, seeing a chance to humiliate the Green family while lining his own pockets, brokered the deal. He sold Arabella's debt to the stranger. Now the floorboards vibrated beneath Arabella's worn leather boots. The congregation was taking their seats out in the nave. She could hear the rustle of cheap taffeta, the clearing of throats, the low, eager murmurs. Half the town of Blackwood Crossing had turned up to watch Thomas Green sell his only daughter to a wild man. "It's time, Thomas," a voice barked from the doorway. Josiah Carter stood there, a pocket watch dangling from his manicured fingers. He wore a charcoal suit that absorbed the oppressive summer heat, yet he didn't look like he was sweating at all. His smile was a thin, cruel slit. Arabella finally moved. She smoothed the skirt of her dress. It was a faded cream monstrosity borrowed from the baker's widow, smelling faintly of mothballs and despair. The hem was an inch too short, exposing her scuffed boots. She didn't care. She reached down, picking up a small bouquet of limp, dust-choked sage her neighbor had shoved into her hands, and walked past her father. She stopped in front of Carter. She could smell peppermint oil on his breath, masking something sour underneath. "You look beautiful, Arabella," Carter whispered, leaning in just close enough to invade her space. "It's a shame to send you up that mountain. You could have stayed here, lived comfortably." "I would rather freeze in the dirt," Arabella said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. She pushed past him, grabbing her father's elbow. Her grip was brutal, her nails digging through the thin wool of his coat. It wasn't for his support. It was to keep herself tethered to the ground. The heavy oak doors opened. The heat in the sanctuary was suffocating. Sunlight stabbed through the cheap stained glass, casting sickly yellow and bruised purple light across the pews. Faces turned. Dozens of them. Arabella kept her chin parallel to the floor. She saw Mrs. Gable whispering behind a gloved hand. She saw the blacksmith, arms crossed, shaking his head. They were swimming in a sea of morbid curiosity. Then she saw him. Caleb Wyatt stood at the altar. He didn't belong in a church. He didn't belong within 4 walls. He was too large, taking up the space of 2 ordinary men, his shoulders broad and thick under a dark wool coat that looked older than the building itself. He hadn't bothered to wear a tie. His collar was open, revealing sun-baked skin and a thick scar running down his throat. His hair was dark, pulled back and tied with a simple leather thong, but stray strands framed a face that looked carved from rough sandstone. He didn't look nervous. He didn't look proud. He looked utterly bored. Arabella felt a sudden, violent spike of panic. This wasn't a man. This was a force of nature. A bear stuffed into human clothes. As she walked down the aisle, the dust motes dancing in the heavy air, she caught his scent. It cut through the perfume and sweat of the crowd. Pine pitch, wood smoke, clean dirt, old leather. Her father released her arm and stepped back with a pathetic shuffle. Arabella stepped up beside Caleb. She didn't reach his shoulder. He turned his head slowly, looking down at her. His eyes were the color of bruised thunderclouds, a dark, turbulent grey. They didn't hold cruelty, but they didn't hold warmth either. They were calculating. He looked at her the way a man assesses a horse before a long, hard winter. "You're shaking," he murmured. His voice was lower than she expected, a vibration she felt in her chest before her ears registered the sound. "I am angry," she replied, staring straight ahead at the sweating preacher. "There is a difference." A muscle in his jaw twitched. Was it amusement? She couldn't tell. He turned back to the front. The preacher, Reverend Stokes, wiped his forehead with a crumpled handkerchief. He rushed through the liturgy. There was no homily about love, no poetry about 2 souls joining. This was a transaction, and everyone wanted the ink dry before the storm broke. "Do you, Caleb Wyatt, take this woman?" "I do," Caleb interrupted before Stokes could finish the sentence. Stokes blinked, flustered. "And do you, Arabella?" "Yes," she snapped. The word tasted like ash. "Then by the power vested in me, I pronounce you man and wife." Stokes looked relieved. "You may kiss the bride." Caleb didn't move toward her. He didn't lean in. He simply reached out and took her hand. His palm was a landscape of calluses, rough as raw lumber, but his grip was surprisingly careful. He didn't crush her small fingers. "Let's go," he said. They didn't walk down the aisle. They marched out of it. Arabella struggled to match his long, consuming strides. The congregation swiveled in their pews, murmuring loudly now. They felt cheated. There was no kiss, no weeping breakdown from the bride, no triumphant gloating from the mountain man. Just a brisk, businesslike exit. The heavy wooden doors banged open against the siding of the church, letting in the blinding glare of the midday sun. Dust immediately swirled around their ankles. Josiah Carter was waiting on the porch, flanked by 2 of his hired hands. He held a leather ledger tucked under his arm, looking immensely pleased with himself. "Not so fast, Wyatt," Carter called out, stepping into their path. Caleb stopped. He dropped Arabella's hand and shifted his weight. The movement was subtle, but Arabella felt the air pressure change around him. It was the coiled stillness of a predator deciding whether to strike or walk away. "The ceremony is over, Carter," Caleb said. His tone was flat. "It is," Carter agreed, patting the ledger. "But the debt ain't formally settled until I have the agreed-upon sum in hand. $800, Wyatt. In coin or notes. You said you'd bring it to the wedding?" The crowd poured out of the church behind them, spilling onto the steps and the dry grass. They went completely silent. $800 was an astronomical sum. It was enough to buy 3 farms the size of the Greens. No one believed a trapper had that kind of money. They all suspected Caleb had lied, and Carter was about to void the marriage, claim the girl, and have Wyatt thrown in the territorial jail for fraud. Arabella felt a sickening lurch in her stomach. Had she just endured all of this for nothing? Was she going to be handed right back to Carter? She looked up at Caleb. His profile was carved from granite. He didn't look worried. "I brought it," Caleb said. He whistled, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the hot air. From the shadow of the livery across the street, a massive draft horse ambled into the sunlight. It was a beast of a horse, black as pitch, dragging its hooves through the dust. Slung across its broad back were 2 large, heavy canvas saddlebags. Caleb walked down the steps. The crowd parted for him instinctively. He reached the horse, unbuckled one of the bags, and hauled it over his shoulder. It looked incredibly heavy, the thick canvas straining against whatever was inside. He walked back up the steps and stopped right in front of Carter. Carter held his ground, but Arabella noticed the slight swallow in his throat. $800, Carter said, holding out a hand. Caleb didn't hand it to him. He unlaced the thick leather drawstrings of the bag. He reached inside and pulled out a smaller, heavily stitched burlap sack. He didn't hand that to Carter either. He dropped it. The sack hit the wooden boards of the church porch with a sound that defied its size. It was a dense, metallic thud, accompanied by the grinding crunch of heavy objects shifting against each other. The wood of the porch actually groaned under the impact. The stitching at the top of the burlap gave way. Silence slammed into the town of Blackwood Crossing. Out of the torn burlap spilled dull, jagged yellow rocks. They weren't coins. They weren't polished. They were raw, filthy, heavy chunks of unrefined gold. Some were the size of walnuts. One piece, resting near the toe of Carter's polished boot, was the size of a grown man's fist. Nobody breathed. The only sound was the dry wind rustling the dead grass. "There's roughly 4 pounds there," Caleb said, his voice carrying over the paralyzed crowd. "At the assay office in Denver, that's over $1,000. Carter stared at the ground. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The smug superiority melted off his face, replaced by a naked, trembling greed. He slowly bent his knees, reaching a hand out toward the largest nugget. Before his fingers could touch it, Caleb's heavy boot came down, pinning the burlap and the gold to the floorboards. Carter froze, looking up. "The debt is $800, Caleb said. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket. The deed of debt he had forced Carter to sign in the store. He dropped it onto the pile of gold. "Keep the change. But understand this, Carter." Caleb leaned down. He didn't raise his voice, but the sheer menace in his tone made the hairs on Arabella's arms stand up. "Thomas Green owes you nothing. His farm is his. And the girl—" Caleb glanced back at Arabella. "The girl is mine. You look at her again. You speak her name. You send a man up my mountain, and I will come down here and burn your store to the foundation with you locked inside. Are we clear?" Carter swallowed hard. He nodded, once, a pathetic, jerky motion. Caleb lifted his boot. He turned his back on the richest man in town, walked up the steps, and picked up Arabella's battered leather trunk, as if it weighed no more than a bundle of kindling. "Wagons at the livery," he said to her, not waiting for a response. Arabella stood rooted to the spot for a second. She looked at the gold, then at the stunned, open-mouthed faces of the townsfolk who had come to see her ruined. She looked at her father, who was weeping silently into his hands. She felt no pity, no regret, just a strange, cold clarity. She hiked up the skirt of the awful cream dress, stepped carefully over the pile of raw gold, and followed her husband into the dust. The wooden wheels of the wagon ground over shattered shale and exposed roots, snapping Arabella's teeth together with every jolt. They had been climbing for 4 hours. The town of Blackwood Crossing was a distant, insignificant grey smudge on the plains below, swallowed by the heat haze. Up here, the world was different. The oppressive, dusty heat of the valley floor had been stripped away, replaced by air that was thin, sharp, and smelling heavily of damp earth and crushed pine needles. They sat side by side on the hard wooden bench of the wagon, the massive black draft horse pulling them up the steep, winding switchbacks with slow, mechanical rhythm. Caleb hadn't spoken a word since they left the livery. He held the reins loosely in his massive, scarred hands, his eyes constantly scanning the dense tree line. Arabella clung to the edge of the seat, her knuckles white. The corset was bruising her ribs with every bump, and the borrowed dress was covered in a fine layer of grey dust. She was exhausted, terrified, and violently angry, though the anger was beginning to fray at the edges, revealing the deep, dark well of exhaustion beneath. She kept waiting for him to do something, to leer at her, to make a crude joke, to assert his ownership. That's what men like Carter did. They bought things to play with them. But Caleb just drove the wagon. He didn't even look at her. It was as if she were a sack of flour he had picked up at the mercantile. How much further? She finally snapped. The silence was driving her mad. It was too big, too heavy. Caleb didn't turn his head. An hour, maybe less if the gelding doesn't throw a shoe. His voice was calm, infuriatingly calm. "Where did you get it?" she asked. "Get what?" "The gold." Caleb shifted the reins to his left hand and reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small tin. He opened it, packed a pinch of chewing tobacco into his lower lip, and snapped the tin shut. "Mountain has secrets," he said flatly. "I know a few of them." "You overpaid," she said bitterly. "My father's debt was $800. You gave him $1,000. You threw away $200 just to make a point." Caleb finally turned to look at her. His grey eyes dragged over her dusty dress, her tight, angry face, and the white knuckle grip she had on the wagon seat. "I didn't throw it away," he said. "I bought your pride. If I paid the exact coin, Carter would have told the town he drove a hard bargain and won. By dumping gold on his boots and leaving the rest, he's the beggar picking up scraps. The town won't talk about the poor green girl getting sold. They'll talk about the fool who left $200 in raw gold on the church porch." Arabella blinked. The logic was so cold, so ruthlessly calculated, it stunned her. He hadn't done it out of arrogance. He had done it to control the narrative. He had protected her reputation with brute financial force. She swallowed hard, staring down at her lap. "You didn't have to do that." "You're my wife now," he said, turning back to the road. "I don't leave my things for the coyotes to chew on." My things. The words hit her like a splash of ice water. The momentary gratitude vanished, replaced by the familiar, rigid resentment. He wasn't a savior. He was just a different kind of owner. He had bought a wife, bought her pride, and now he was taking his purchase home. The wagon lurched around a tight bend, the wheels complaining loudly, and suddenly the dense wall of pine trees broke. Arabella gasped, though she tried to suppress it. They had entered a high alpine clearing. A pristine, glassy lake reflected the jagged, snow-capped peaks that surrounded them on 3 sides, and sitting on a gentle rise overlooking the water was the cabin. She had expected a hovel, a dark, filthy dugout smelling of animal skins and rotting meat. What she saw was a fortress. It was built of massive, hand-peeled logs, perfectly notched and chinked with pale mortar. A wide, covered porch wrapped around 2 sides, stacked high with neat, geometric cords of split firewood. Smoke curled lazily from a heavy stone chimney. It wasn't just a shelter, it was a home carved out of the wilderness with brutal, meticulous care. Caleb pulled the wagon to a halt near the porch. He tied off the reins and climbed down, his boots crunching loudly on the gravel. He didn't offer her a hand. He walked to the back of the wagon, hauled out her heavy trunk, and carried it up the steps. Arabella sat frozen for a moment. The air was so quiet here, she could hear the blood rushing in her ears. A hawk shrieked somewhere high above. She climbed down awkwardly, the stiff fabric of the dress catching on the wagon brake. She stumbled, landing hard on the gravel and scraping her palms. She hissed in pain, glaring at the cabin door. Caleb walked out, saw her brushing the dirt off her hands, and stopped. He looked at the ugly cream dress, the rigid corset digging into her sides, the dust streaking her pale face. "Take that off," he said. Arabella froze. Her heart slammed against her ribs like a trapped bird. The cold fear she had kept at bay all day flooded her veins. This was it. The debt was paid, they were isolated, and he was collecting his due. "What?" she breathed, taking a step backward. Caleb sighed, a heavy, exhausted sound. He pointed a thick finger at the door. "The dress," he said, his voice grating with irritation. "You look like you're wrapped in a flour sack and corset wire. You can't breathe, and you can't walk. Go inside. Your trunk is by the bed. Put on something made of cotton, something you can move in." He turned away from her, walking toward the exhausted draft horse to unharness it. "Then come back out," he called over his shoulder. "You need to learn how to split kindling before the sun goes down." Arabella stood alone in the yard, the cold mountain wind biting through the thin fabric of her sleeves. She looked at the man unbuckling leather straps with methodical care. He hadn't lunged at her. He hadn't demanded his rights. He had told her to change clothes so she could do chores. The absurdity of it all bubbled up in her chest. She let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh, grabbed the skirts of the hated dress, and marched up the steps into the dark, smelling the faint scent of cedar and old ash. The cabin smelled of dried peppermint, wood ash, and oiled iron. Arabella stood just inside the heavy oak door, waiting for her eyes to adjust to the dim light filtering through the 2 small, thick-paned windows. It was not a cage. It was a machine for surviving. Every object had a designated place, born of harsh necessity. Cast-iron skillets hung from forged iron hooks near the massive stone hearth. Bundles of drying herbs and salted meat hung from the exposed rafters, casting long, distorted shadows across the wide plank floor. In the far corner sat a large bed frame built of peeled lodgepole pine, covered with a heavy, hand-stitched quilt that looked surprisingly clean. There was no dust. There were no cobwebs. The man lived with the meticulous, neurotic order of someone who knew that a lost knife or a misplaced matchbox could mean freezing to death in January. Arabella found her battered leather trunk sitting exactly where he had left it, at the foot of the bed. Her fingers fumbled with the brass latches. They were stiff and cold. She turned her back to the empty room and began the agonizing process of unhooking the borrowed dress. The corset followed. When the rigid, yellowed whalebone finally gave way, Arabella took her first full breath in 8 hours. Her ribs ached with a dull, throbbing intensity. The cool cabin air hit her damp chemise, raising goosebumps along her arms. She shivered, quickly pulling a faded, indigo-dyed cotton work dress from her trunk. It was frayed at the cuffs and smelled faintly of the lye soap she used back at the farm, but slipping it over her head felt like putting on armor. She braided her hair with vicious, sharp tugs, tying it off with a scrap of leather. When she stepped back out onto the porch, the sun was beginning its descent behind the jagged peaks to the west. The sky was bruising into deep violets and angry, fiery oranges. The temperature had already plummeted 15 degrees. The thin mountain air bit at her exposed cheeks. Caleb was by the side of the cabin, rhythmic dull thuds echoing off the timberline. He had a massive splitting maul in his hands, reducing sections of pine trunk into neat, triangular wedges of firewood with terrifying, effortless swings. He saw her walk down the steps. He didn't stop swinging. He simply nodded his chin toward a smaller chopping block a few yards away. Next to it lay a pile of thin, dry spruce branches and a small rusted hatchet. "Stovewood," Caleb said, the maul coming down and cleanly separating a massive log with a sharp crack. "Needs to be thin enough to catch a spark, thick enough to hold a flame." Arabella walked over to the block. She picked up the hatchet. The hickory handle was dark and slick from years of absorbed sweat. It felt heavier than it looked. She grabbed a piece of spruce, set it on the block, and swung. The blade hit the wood at an angle, bouncing off with a jarring vibration that shot straight up her forearm and rattled her teeth. The piece of spruce clattered into the dirt. Caleb stopped chopping. He rested the head of his maul on the ground and watched her. He didn't laugh. He didn't sneer. He just watched. Arabella felt a hot flush of humiliation creep up her neck. She gritted her teeth, picked up the spruce, set it back on the block, and swung harder. This time, the hatchet bit into the wood, but got hopelessly stuck halfway down. She yanked on the handle. It didn't budge. She put her boot against the block and hauled with all her meager weight, her face turning crimson. A shadow fell over her. Caleb stepped up behind her. She caught his scent again, sharper now, edged with fresh sweat and the raw, sappy bleed of the split pine. She stiffened, instinctively leaning away from his massive frame. "You're fighting the wood," he said. His voice was right by her ear, a low, gravelly rumble. He reached out. She flinched, but his hands bypassed her entirely, wrapping around the handle of the hatchet just above her own white-knuckled grip. His skin was rough as sandpaper, radiating a furnace-like heat. "Let go," he instructed. She released the handle, stepping quickly to the side. Caleb easily wrenched the hatchet free. He set the wood back in the center of the block. He didn't look at her. He looked at the grain. "Wood has a memory," he said, tapping the flat side of the hatchet blade against a faint, twisting line in the spruce. "It grows with the wind and the sun. It builds tension. You don't just hack at it. You find the fault line. You strike where it already wants to break." He swung the hatchet in a short, lazy arc. It hit the exact spot he had tapped. The spruce popped apart in two perfect, symmetrical halves. He handed the hatchet back to her handle first. "Try again." He turned his back and walked over to the horse, picking up a stiff brush to begin grooming the massive animal. Arabella stared at the hatchet in her hand. The metal of the handle was still warm from his grip. She hated him for being right. She hated that he wasn't yelling at her. It would be so much easier to fight a monster. Monsters you could scream at. Monsters you could actively plot against. Caleb was a brick wall. You couldn't fight a wall. You just exhausted yourself punching it. She picked up another piece of wood. She looked at the grain, tracing the slight twist in the bark. She raised the hatchet and brought it down. Crack, it split. Not perfectly, but it split. She set up another piece. Crack. She chopped until the sun vanished entirely, leaving the high valley drowned in a cold, blue twilight. She chopped until her shoulders burned with a deep, lactic fire and a blister swelled raw and angry at the base of her right thumb. The pile of kindling beside the block grew steadily. She didn't stop until Caleb walked past her, carrying his maul and a massive armful of split logs. "Enough," he said, not breaking his stride toward the porch. "Bring it inside. Temperature's dropping." Arabella gathered the splintered wood into the skirt of her dress, her hands shaking slightly from the exertion. As she followed him up the wooden steps, the first real shiver of the night rattled through her bones. The heat inside the cabin was immediate and aggressive. Caleb had a fire roaring in the hearth within minutes, the dry spruce she had chopped catching the sparks from his flint with an eager hiss. He lit a single kerosene lantern on the heavy plank table, casting a warm, flickering pool of yellow light that pushed back the creeping shadows. Arabella stood near the door, awkwardly clutching her skirt full of kindling. "Bin next to the stove." Caleb pointed without looking up. He was already working at a small butcher block counter, slicing a slab of salt pork with a knife that looked sharp enough to shave with. She dumped the wood into the metal bin, the clatter echoing loudly in the quiet room. She stood there, rubbing her sore thumb, waiting for an order. When none came, she walked to the table and sat down on a rough-hewn bench. The silence stretched. It wasn't the awkward, suffocating silence of the church vestry. It was the heavy, functional silence of the wilderness. The only sounds were the crackle and spit of the fire, the rhythmic slicing of the knife, and the wind beginning to moan around the eaves of the cabin. Caleb tossed the pork into a heavy iron pot. It began to sizzle immediately, filling the room with the rich, salty smell of rendering fat. He added a handful of dried onions, half a cup of water from a pail, and a large scoop of dried beans. He worked with an economy of motion that fascinated her, despite her resentment. He wasted no energy. He didn't pace. He didn't sigh. He moved like a gear in a well-oiled clock. He grabbed a tin coffee pot, threw in a handful of grounds, filled it with water, and set it directly onto the glowing coals at the edge of the hearth. 10 minutes later, he set a dented tin plate in front of her. It was a crude, thick stew, grey and unappetizing to look at, accompanied by a hard, dry biscuit. He set a tin cup of coffee, black as pitch and smelling of burnt earth, next to it. He took his own plate and sat opposite her at the table. He didn't offer a prayer. He just picked up his iron spoon and started eating. Arabella stared at the food. Her stomach cramped violently, reminding her she hadn't eaten since a piece of dry toast at dawn. She picked up her spoon. The stew was fiercely hot, burning the roof of her mouth, and heavily salted. It was exactly what her exhausted body craved. She ate quickly, abandoning any pretense of table manners, chasing the heavy beans down with scalding sips of the bitter coffee. Caleb finished his plate and pushed it aside. He leaned back on the bench, watching her scrape the last remnants of the stew with the edge of her biscuit. "You didn't cry today," he said suddenly. Arabella stopped chewing. She swallowed the dry lump of biscuit, her throat clicking audibly in the quiet cabin. She looked up. His grey eyes were fixed on her, unreadable in the lantern light. "Would it have pleased you if I did?" she asked, her voice defensive, edges sharp. "Wouldn't have mattered?" Caleb replied smoothly. "But it tells me something." "And what is that?" "That you aren't completely useless." The blunt insult made her jaw tighten. "I am not a beast of burden for you to evaluate." "Up here you are," Caleb said. There was no malice in his tone, just brutal honesty. "We're 80 miles from a doctor, 4 hours down a mountain to the nearest bag of flour. In 3 months the snow will be 6 feet deep against that door. A fragile woman, a weeping woman, dies up here. And she usually takes her husband with her." Arabella set her spoon down with a metallic clatter. "Then why buy me? There were stronger girls in town, girls who would have gladly traded their lives for $1,000 in gold. Caleb reached into his pocket and pulled out his tin of tobacco. He packed a pinch, his eyes never leaving hers. "I saw you on the porch of the Mercantile last week," he said slowly. "When Carter came out to collect his interest from your father." Arabella remembered. It had been a humiliating display. Carter had spoken down to her father like he was a disobedient dog, while her father stared at the floorboards, taking it. "Your father looked like a whipped cur," Caleb continued. "But you were standing behind him. You were looking at Carter's throat." Arabella blinked, caught off guard. "You looked at him," Caleb said, his voice dropping to a low, rough whisper, like you were doing the math on exactly how much pressure it would take to crush his windpipe. He closed the tobacco tin with a sharp snap. "I don't need a farm girl to churn butter. I need someone who won't freeze in her tracks when a grizzly rips the door off the hinges in January. I need someone with enough anger to survive." He stood up, his massive frame casting a shadow that swallowed the entire table. He picked up both their plates and carried them to a wash basin. Arabella sat frozen, the bitter taste of the coffee lingering on her tongue. He hadn't bought her because she was young, or because she was pretty, or because he wanted a bedmate. He had bought her because he recognized the violence in her survival instinct. He had bought a cornered animal. She watched him pump water over the dishes. "Where do I sleep?" she asked. The question hung heavy in the air. This was the moment. The practicalities were over. Caleb dried his hands on a rag. He walked past the table, past the hearth, and stopped at the massive pine bed in the corner. Arabella's muscles coiled tight. She pushed herself back slightly on the bench, her hand instinctively drifting towards the heavy iron spoon on the table. Caleb reached down and grabbed the thick quilt. He stripped it off the bed. He then reached under the bed frame and dragged out a massive, thick bearskin pelt. He tossed the pelt onto the floor, right in front of the hearth. He dropped the quilt on top of it. He walked over to the lantern and blew out the flame. The cabin plunged into darkness, illuminated only by the restless orange glow of the dying fire. "The bed is yours." Caleb's voice came from the shadows near the hearth. She heard the heavy rustle of him lying down on the bearskin, the wood floor groaning slightly under his weight. Arabella sat in the dark for a long time. She listened. She waited for the sound of him creeping across the floorboards. She waited for the trick, the sudden shift in demeanor. But there was nothing, only the sound of the wind, the crackle of the embers, and eventually the deep, slow, rhythmic breathing of a man fast asleep. Slowly, her hands trembling slightly, Arabella stood up. She walked over to the bed in the corner. She didn't take off her dress. She didn't unlace her boots. She crawled onto the mattress, curling her knees to her chest, pulling her arms tight around herself. The sheets smelled of pine and cold air. She stared into the darkness, her mind spinning. She was a captive. She was a traded debt. She was angry, exhausted, and miles from civilization. Yet, as she listened to the slow, even breathing of the giant sleeping on the floor between her and the door, a strange, utterly confusing realization settled over her. For the first time in 5 years, she felt perfectly, undeniably safe. The first frost arrived 3 weeks later, a creeping white rime that killed the last of the alpine wildflowers and turned the high meadow into a brittle, snapping graveyard. Arabella woke in the dark, her breath pluming in the freezing cabin air. The rhythm of her life had shifted from the stagnant, hopeless waiting of her father's farm to a brutal, exhausting cadence of survival. She no longer wore the corset. She no longer cried. Her hands, once soft and raw, had begun to turn into tools. The blister at the base of her thumb had burst, scabbed, and hardened into a thick, yellow callus. She smelled perpetually of wood smoke, lye soap, and the sharp tang of pine pitch. Caleb was already gone. He was always gone before the sun broke the ridgeline. He left the fire banked and a pot of oats simmering on the iron stove. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, her bare feet hitting the freezing floorboards. The bearskin rug near the hearth was empty. Every night he slept on the floor. Every morning he left before she woke. They moved around each other like two solitary predators sharing a small territory, careful not to cross paths too abruptly. They spoke mostly in verbs and nouns. Fetch water, split wood, hold this. Arabella pulled on her heavy wool stockings and laced her boots. She ate the oats standing up, staring out the frosted window panes. Around mid-morning, the massive black draft horse plodded into the clearing. Caleb walked beside it. Slung over the horse's broad rump was a large mule deer buck, its tongue hanging loose, blood freezing in dark, crusty streaks down its grey coat. Arabella stepped onto the porch, pulling her shawl tight across her shoulders. The wind bit at her nose. Caleb didn't greet her. He unlooped a thick coil of hemp rope from the saddle horn, tossed it over a sturdy oak branch near the cabin, and hoisted the deer up by its hind legs. The pulley groaned. "Get a knife," he called out, tying off the rope, the short one with the bone handle, and the tin bucket. Arabella's stomach gave a familiar, uneasy lurch, but she turned and went inside. A month ago she would have balked. She would have told him that butchering was a man's job, or the butcher's job back in town. Now she just grabbed the knife and the bucket. Meat didn't come wrapped in paper up here. She walked back out and set the bucket under the swaying carcass. Caleb was rolling up his sleeves,